Operation. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to welcome you to this webinar, Time to Empower Cities, Digital Services Act and Cities' Efforts for Affordable Housing. Let me briefly touch upon the political challenge that we will discuss today before I will introduce today's speakers. In the last years, rents increased enormously in cities across Europe. Short-term rental platforms such as Airbnb have a high impact on this problematic development. Let me give you just 3 examples. In Barcelona, for instance, new rents increased by 90% from presence of Airbnb, or driven by the presence of Airbnb. In neighborhoods in Amsterdam, 1 in 9 rental units are rented on Airbnb in certain neighborhoods. And in Paris, up to 25,000 housing units are lost due to the presence and the business model of Airbnb. And these numbers already show how big the impact of short-term rental platforms is, and more findings, and also a question how to regulate these platforms will you later hear from our guests. And during our work in the last couple of months in the European Parliament, working on the Digital Services Act initiative report from the Parliament, we were often astonished how the simplest requests of cooperation from local authorities to platforms were simply neglected. And the result is clear: if there is no data, then you cannot regulate. And that's why I'm glad that we succeeded in addressing this problem in that initiative report, together with other political groups, with the support of other political groups. But this has been one of our key demands. And now all eyes are, of course, on the upcoming DSA legislative package presented by the Commission in December, on December 15th. And it is up to us to make use of this opportunity politically to address the lack of cooperation between platforms and authorities, but not only to address it, but to fix it in the end. And in order to find out how this cooperation should look like, we are very glad, as the left group in the European Parliament, that we could win Murray and Kenneth to draft the study Platform Failures: How Short-Term Rental Platforms like Airbnb Fail to Cooperate with Cities and the Need for Strong Regulations to Protect Housing. And this study has been presented to the public only today, and we already received several media requests. I guess at least 10 newspapers picked already up on the study and reported about it. So it's already a huge media success, but now we have, of course, to make the content political success. So let me do a very short introduction of our speakers. One of the 2 authors, Murray Cox, he is not only working on that study, but he's also the man behind InsideAirbnb.com. And if you don't know it yet, you urgently should check it out, because it gives you plenty of information about Airbnb and about what Airbnb is really doing in its business model. Kenneth Haar, the second author, is a long-standing member of Corporate Europe Observatory, and he's not only very knowledgeable when it comes to big tech companies like Airbnb or big platforms, but also when it comes to lobbying and harmful business models. And I want to thank the both of you for all the work and the time spent on this study. I want to thank you also for bearing with us. I know it was not ever easy. We pushed you quite hard because there were certain deadlines that needed to be met, but I'm very thankful, grateful for this successful cooperation so far, and we are all looking forward to your presentation today. And after your presentation, I'm delighted that we have several experts with whom we will discuss your study, the content of the study, but also the political challenges in their respective cities and their respective member states of the European Union. And it's an all-female panel, which I'm also very proud of. And I begin to introduce the speakers in an alphabetical order. Barbara Steenbergen, she is the representative of the International Union of Tenants in Brussels and a long-standing ally also for our political work regarding all questions when it comes to tenants. Katalin, warm welcome, Barbara. Warm welcome. And Katalin Genburg from Berlin, from Die Linke, which is also my party, by the way. She's a member of the regional parliament in Berlin and is, let me put it like this, she is the expert of my party when it comes to the question of social housing, but she's also working for a very long time now on questions of Airbnb and other booking platforms. So also a very warm welcome to you, Katalin. I'm glad to see you again, even if only remotely, but hello. And the next speaker then on our panel will be Leila Chaibi. She's a fellow colleague of mine. We work together in the left group in the European Parliament. She is a member of the European Parliament from France, from La France Insoumise. And if I may dare to say so, she's one of the most inspiring members of our group. Just recently, she drafted a directive on platform workers, handed it over to the Commissioner Schmidt, and she did so because she could not wait for her liberal colleague to come up with the official proposal. So she just took the initiative and presented her own proposal. So also a very warm welcome to Leila, and she also works for a very long time already on questions like booking platforms and Airbnb. And last but not least, Michaela Kauer. She is head of Brussels, the Brussels office of the city of Vienna. And apart from your official representative function for the city of Vienna, I think it's not wrong to say that you are also the driving force behind the Fair Digital Europe network. And the network was of great help to us, also to me personally in my political work on the Digital Services Act initiative report, but it will also be very helpful in the future when we work on the legislative file. So thank you, first of all, for this cooperation. And I also want to extend a very warm welcome to you. And last but not least, I regret we invited someone from the Commission, would also have been a woman, but unfortunately she had to decline the invitation because the Commission and the unit working on the DSA is for now not allowed to speak publicly about the upcoming legislative proposals. So I regret this very much, but we would very much have enjoyed also to discuss the future challenges with the Commission, but this is not possible, unfortunately. So, and short remark on the time schedule before we can then start with the presentation. We would begin with the presentation of the study by Murray and Kenneth for half an hour. For half an hour sharp. We only have 2 hours in total. Then we would open the floor for our experts, for our panel, for 55 minutes of discussion, and then leave the floor open for another half an hour for the participants to step in. And dear participants, if you already have questions, you can put them in the chat function and we can pick them up during the discussion or then later when we will open the floor for you. We have interpretation, or interpretation will be provided in English, French, and German. Also a big thank you goes to the support or to the interpreters. My name is Martin Schirdewan. I'm co-chair of the Left in the European Parliament. And Murray and Kenneth, the floor is yours for 30 minutes.
Great, thank you, Martin. And hello to my fellow panelists and also the guests that are joining us. It's the afternoon here. I'm located just out of New York. But I just wanted to also thank the Left for the opportunity to do this important study. It was useful for me as well. As Martin mentioned, I run a website called Inside Airbnb, and it's a data activist website. So I collect data on Airbnb, and I've been doing that for 5 years. But also, as part of that work has evolved, I've been in contact with community activists and cities around the world, and my role has become more about advocating for policies, regulation, enforcement of short-term rentals. So I'm going to try to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes and then hand over to my co-author, Kenneth. But the idea for this study really started over the myth of cooperation. I think when we first started talking about the report, the idea that short-term rental platforms like Airbnb were appearing to cooperate with cities. If you can just go to the next slide, please. And is it possible to pin the slides up? Yep, thank you. So there's this myth of cooperation. And even sometimes I get confused. Like, is Airbnb cooperating with Amsterdam? They just settled a lawsuit with New York City. Are they cooperating? What's going to happen? And I think that I would encourage you to read the report, because there's a lot of information in the report that I'm not going to cover today. It breaks out 8 different cities in detail, the different regulations, the different interactions with the platforms. But I think I just really wanted to break down why is there this myth of cooperation? Why do platforms like Airbnb, who are not cooperating with cities, why do they want to have the appearance of a cooperation, the appearance of self-regulation or being well regulated? And it's really simple. In the case of Airbnb, they're a private company that are about to go public. I think they're even, going public this week. And so basically $40 billion is at stake for their investors. And their investors don't want any risks. At least that would disrupt the IPO, and some of their long-term investors who would be signing up would be interested in continued growth from this company. So the appearance of being well regulated is important for investors. It's also important for those platforms, for city regulators, not to think that they need to regulate these platforms, and that includes the EU as they think about important updates to laws like with the Digital Services Act. Next slide, please. So the main reason why this is important from my point of view, and I hope your point of view as well, is the impact that the short-term rentals are having on cities. Martin mentioned some figures for some cities. And you can see on the screen some other ones. In New York City, all of the renters in the city paid an extra $616 million in 1 year. It was basically a tax that every renter had to pay because of Airbnb, about $470 a year for each renter. And so the impact on cities is well understood. There could be more work and more studies that could be done. But I think the impact is really simple. If you're taking a unit off the housing market by renting it to tourists, you're taking a unit off full time, you're not living there, then it introduces it reduces the supply of housing. Housing researchers, they usually, when they do their studies on cities, there are 2 approaches that they take. Sometimes they look at the supply being lost, and there's a direct correlation in terms of the impact on rents, or they study rents over a period of time and they look at the presence of Airbnb. But this is starting to become well understood. If your city hasn't done a study on Airbnb, I would encourage you to do that, because I think we need that fact established in every city. The impact might differ by neighborhood, so I think that's also important to understand. And I think that also helps you to understand how to regulate in each city. Next slide, please. Now, as we think about short-term rentals, it used to be called home sharing or the sharing economy. But what we're really finding with the data is that there's not a lot of sharing going on. If we look at Paris, for example, and this is data from February, just prior to COVID, we see that almost half of the listings in Airbnb are of a commercial nature, so they're a single home that's being rented out full-time on Airbnb, or someone that has multiple homes that they're renting, like they created a portfolio, or if someone's renting multiple rooms. But more importantly, it's creating 85% of this platform's revenue, Airbnb's platform. So you can see that there's a clear motivation for both hosts and also for the platforms to continue this commercial use. And the commercial use has the most impact on housing, also quality of life issues as well. There's been a lot of studies that look at the financial incentive of renting short-term versus long-term, and that's also been established. But I think we really need to think about this idea of home sharing is only a small proportion of the activity that's occurring in most cities and most towns. Next slide, please. Barcelona is another good example where they have been reasonably successful at regulating short-term rentals. But in Barcelona, they have a cap of about 9,600 licenses that are given out for the entire apartment type of rental. But you can still see here, even though they're being able to manage the activity of short-term rentals relatively well, it's still highly commercial. And that's something that they're going to address, I believe, soon. So they have the 9,600 licenses, but but groups of companies have managed to hoard all of those licenses, and they're basically running de facto hotels in Barcelona. Next slide, please. Here you can see a table across all the 8 cities I studied. And if you look at the far right column, you can see that the revenue from commercial use in almost every city is a majority. It's coming from these commercial uses. So these platforms don't want to be regulated because that revenue will disappear. So that's their motivation, and that's the motivation for appearing to cooperate, for refusing to follow the laws in city after city. Next slide, please. So now I'm just going to talk about quickly the ways that the platforms don't cooperate with cities. So I mean, the first thing is that it's difficult to find the hosts or the properties that might be breaking the law. Host names are anonymized. Locations don't appear in the exact location on a map. You can't. In the beginning, when I started this work, you could see the street of a listing. And then after cities started using the street name to try to find the actual location of a property, Airbnb removed the street from the listing. And you would think the street would be useful for a prospective guest that wanted to stay on the platform. And so the only real conclusion is that they removed the street to hide the location from regulators. In some cities, in many cities, they've adopted authorization, permit, or registration schemes. In the platforms will just advertise any listing, regardless of whether they have a mandatory registration system. And the city has no way to contact the host, find the property. And so you see the case, like, for example, in Paris, where they have a mandatory registration system, but 60% of listings on Airbnb don't have that registration number. And in Berlin, it's 80%. So basically, 60% of Paris's Airbnb inventory on Airbnb is illegal, and 80% in Berlin. In New York City, they don't have a permit system, but the city estimates that 85% of active Airbnb listings are illegal under their housing laws. There's been a lot of advancements in data. So there are some cities that are receiving data from the platforms. Barcelona has, via really one of its only kind in the world, almost, where they're receiving data from the platform. Paris is receiving data due to national French laws. New York City is about to receive data. But in the case of Barcelona, the data they're receiving from the platform, 60 to 70% of them, of the data they receive, don't have addresses, or they've got invalid or fake addresses. And so it's really difficult for regulators to find these illegal listings. And we'll talk about some solutions to that in a second. Next slide, please. Now, this idea about what's illegal offline, how can it be legal online? And I think we all understand that some of these platforms, it might be difficult for them to police the content of their site. But really what's being asked to police is very important. Housing being taken off the market is very important. We're already seeing this massive fraudulent use of these platforms, as high as 80 to 85% illegal listings. Platforms, I believe, have a responsibility for the content of their site. And most of the ways that cities are asking platforms to respond are, for example, in Berlin, back in 2016, they made clear that there was a ban on entire apartment rentals. It would be very easy for the platforms to refuse to accept those entire home apartments. Berlin also had a authorization scheme back in 2016 where you could apply for exemptions with a number. So again, it's quite easy for a system to be developed where the platforms would only accept a listing with a registration number. This is occurring, like for example, in Barcelona, they have a good system where the city can demand listings be taken down, and Airbnb will follow. San Francisco also has laws like that. But in other cities, they refuse to take the illegal listings down, Paris and Berlin. So the platforms pick and choose which laws they're going to follow. And so I think that's something that really needs to be addressed by regulations. And I think we have to ensure that the Digital Services Act supports those regulations. Next slide, please. So Airbnb has about 120 lawyers, or they did before their layoffs this year, and a budget of $60 million for lawyers. I think that probably exceeds the legal resources of any city that's there. And so the platforms use the courts, but also the hosts are using the courts as well. And what this really means is that in many cities, the regulators are reluctant to introduce new laws for fear of having to defend them in court. Or if they do have to either defend them in court or take the platforms or hosts to court, sometimes it can take many years. And so in the case study I highlighted, one really important case in Paris where the city took two hosts to court, and because they were using arguments that related to the e-commerce directive, the European Court of Justice took over jurisdiction, and they ruled in favor of Paris's authorization system and method of compensation, and it's now gone back to the national courts. And this whole process has taken 4 years, and in the meantime, Paris has not been able to levy any fines against a host that are illegally renting out apartments. So there's, I think, about 350 cases on hold in Paris. Next slide, please. On the subject of data, this data is really important, and cities, all cities have mentioned that they need detailed data for both forming policy, but also enforcing their laws. There's been a couple of announcements notably in Europe, a data sharing partnership with the European Commission. But this is only for aggregate data across the whole city. And they will only give detailed data in the case that a city has laws which require it. And so it's essentially useless if you haven't got regulations or if the platforms don't acknowledge the law. For all the cities out there that don't have data sharing laws, you should create them. You should work with your city or your national legislators to get data sharing laws for the platforms. AIRBNB also has a city portal. Again, they're only providing aggregate data for most people, which for most cities, which will be tourist data. Just next slide, please. Platforms also offer to negotiate with cities. I studied this last year, and most negotiation processes with cities fail. The only chance really you have of negotiating with a platform is if you're a city like Barcelona that's able to create a lot of publicity around the issues, or if you want to accept taxes from the platform. That's really the only that's really the only types of negotiations that these platforms are interested in. Negotiations really delay any type of regulation. Sometimes it can take a couple of years. In the case of Amsterdam, AIRBNB backed out of their agreement when the city decided to reduce their 60-day cap down to 30-day cap in the interest of their residents. They're not a legal obligation, and they have to be repeated by every platform, whereas regulations can scale across different platforms. Next slide, please. Frequently, we'll see platforms offering to be regulated, and the platforms will offer regulations which they know have proven unsuccessful, like registration schemes that don't have any accountability. And so they've done that in New York City for the last 3 years, and those laws have fortunately not gone anywhere, but it's another tactic that the platforms use. Next slide, please. We already mentioned taxes, so platforms will try to bribe cities with taxes, but this is inconsistent. In the case of Vienna, they did not want to provide the data that was required by law to break down the taxes that they were collecting by hosts. So that's another tactic that platforms use. Next slide, please. So just quickly, I've got a minute or two left before I hand over to Kenneth. These are the different ways that cities are regulating. And so I'd encourage you to look at that later, but I might just move on to the next slide because I'm just running a bit short of time. But the three methods of regulation that I want you to think about is that are proven successful is, and these all need to be done together, a mandatory registration system so that the city is able to determine legal or not. Platform accountability, so platforms can only list properties that have gone through the registration system. And then also disclosing data to the city so that they can verify that all of the listings on these sites have gone through the registration system. And then also a process is in place for asking platforms to take them down. Next slide, please. And so I'm not going to go into all these case studies. I've already mentioned some figures for some of the cities, but I would encourage you to look at the report and go into some detail from the cities. We also have some attendees from those cities here today on the panel. If you just flip to the next slide, there's San Francisco. I really just want to highlight this case study. You see the big drop in the red listings in 2018, their entire home listings. This is what you see with good regulations. And San Francisco has been able to maintain it more or less. There's been a shifting of the market to longer term rentals, like more than 30 days at a time. but this is what you need to see. And we can see that with data. And next slide, please. Here's a case of Berlin, both in 2016 and 2018, they strengthened their laws. See how the red has dropped a little bit in 2016 and then again in 2018. But in 2016, there was an effective ban on entire home rentals. And so you would have expected that to go almost to zero. So this is really telling you how it is difficult to enforce these laws, but we really need to be working on that. I think I'm just going to hand over to Kenneth now, give him some time to walk through the European context and also the Digital Services Act.
Right, thank you. We did this study, of course, in the context of the Digital Services Act that is supposed to be published next week. Can I have the first slide, please? The Digital Services Act is, as many will know, supposed to replace the current set of rules that governs the platforms, the so-called e-commerce directive. And the consequences of the e-commerce directive is, I think, sublimely shown in one of my favorite, my favorite Airbnb quote, something I stumbled across about 2 years ago. This is from the spokesperson of Airbnb in Europe, where we see the right kinds of processes, the right steps being taken. Data is available to people. So basically what Patrick Robinson is saying is that provided Airbnb agrees with the rules in a particular place, then they would seriously consider helping by giving data to the public authorities. I mean, that is a very, very privileged position of a company to be able to decide whether they want to cooperate with authorities or not. And what we need to discuss, of course, is what should the next rule book look like? What kind of space needs to be there for public authorities to be able to enforce the rules that they see fit, they see necessary to achieve goals in the public interest, be they affordable housing or the city landscape more in general. The next slide, please. And there is a very simple solution. The Digital Services Act is set to be a law that will be following the same principles as the e-commerce directive. So it will mainly be about what public authorities cannot do. I'm sure there will be exceptions in there, but I think it's worth considering just for a moment whether the best and most effective strategy would not be for us to make sure that platforms such as Airbnb are not even covered by the Digital Services Act. Many of the demands, if not all the demands presented by cities, are actually about getting the political space, or you could even say the permission under European law, to move ahead with certain measures regarding the platforms. I fully acknowledge that will not be an easy political job, but frankly, it's the case with some other platforms that could be in some ways compared to Airbnb. Uber, for instance, is not covered by the e-commerce directive, and it's what has made it possible for public authorities across Europe to implement measures about Uber-like services that cannot be implemented with Airbnb and short-term rental platforms. But obviously, I mean, we need to discuss too, once the Commission's draft is presented, what more granular proposals could be useful and could be effective as the political debate evolves. Next slide, please. And what we've done is, Murray and I, is actually something very, very simple. We've gone through the evidence from cities and identified the questions where cities have experienced problems with Airbnb. And the first of course, is access to data. That cities need to be able to ask for data in the first place, not just data for statistical or statistical use, but data that will enable cities to enforce whatever local rules may have been adopted. So full disclosure to cities if that's what necessary. That comes with one complication. Next slide, please. Because you cannot assume even that the platforms are already producing the data that public authorities need. There's a case from Barcelona where presumably the city of Barcelona was able to get all the data available from Airbnb, but it proved to be insufficient. There was lots of information missing about the addresses of hosts for a start. Information that was actually crucial to uphold the local rules. So there is a case for asking the platforms to produce more data than they would possess today. Next slide, please. Third, there is the authorization schemes for regulation purposes, of course, to make sure it's necessary to have it explicitly in the Digital Services Act that authorization schemes are allowed, both for hosts and for the platforms themselves. That is absolutely key to the regulation of platforms in most big cities, but not all. And it's not just about being able to see through what platforms are doing when they operate in the city. It is to have a lever, to have a measure that would force them to comply if they don't. The threat of losing an authorization can be a very powerful, is the most powerful weapon in the hands of a public authority. Next slide, please. There we are. Yeah, something that seems so self-evident. Actually, it's in the e-commerce directive that the platforms are supposed to respond immediately to cities when they ask for particular listings to be removed. Experience, however, shows that they're in a position to deny such cooperation. And Murray went through some of the examples, and it's actually pretty widespread that platforms are strong enough under existing rules to deny cooperating with authorities even on illegal listings. Next slide, please. Yeah, full liability where platforms operate. What does full liability mean? Or you could say accountability, or you could say, how do we make absolutely sure that they do not enjoy impunity? If public authorities are to, well, for public authorities to have the, you could say, the full scale of competence to act on breaches of local rules, the most logical step in many cases would be to go to the courts. If regulatory measures don't work, you go to courts. The problem at the moment is that if you have a strife and disagreement with B&B over, say, data, the place to go is to Ireland, because of a principle built into the e-commerce directive called the country of origin principle, which obliges public authorities outside Ireland to conduct most of the court cases in a different country. And to have such a setting means that it actually puts court cases out of reach for, my guess is, for most cities. I'm not aware of any city having taken an issue with Airbnb to court in Ireland. I know some countries have, but for a city to do that is a major obstacle to acting on problems with short-term rental rental platforms. To reverse that would mean to make sure that this country of origin principle does not find its way into the Digital Services Act, at least as far as the short-term rental platforms are concerned. Next slide, please. Yeah, last but not least, an issue that is not so frequently mentioned in this debate is the so-called notification procedure, which is built into several European directives. What notification procedures mean is that very often member states have to report to the Commission when they have adopted a new measure that relates to an issue of a particular European directive. At the moment, it's pretty clear that the European Commission has developed a favorite model, which means that when new rules are adopted in the area of services, they would like to have the competence, the mandate to prevent new rules from even becoming a reality. There was a political debate over that this year. It ended up with the Commission losing, but we would have to be very much aware of what is in the new law when it comes to notification, and be focused on the question of whether the notification procedure will make it very difficult for public authorities at all levels to adopt a new rule, and to consider whether it would provide the Commission with an opportunity, with a mandate to do away with rules that they feel would go against the design of the new act. So yeah, so 6 points in all of them derived from the studies that in particular Murray has done about several European cities and US cities.
So thank you very much, Murray and Kenneth, for the presentation of the study and for the presentation of your key findings. I would like to give the floor immediately to our panelists. I would also switch to my mother tongue now, to German, as there is interpretation provided. Michaela Kauer wäre die erste Rednerin, die ich jetzt bitten würde, sich erstens zu den präsentierten Ergebnissen der Studie zu äußern, aber gleichzeitig auch natürlich vor ihrem Hintergrund des Netzwerkes Fair Digital Europe auf den vor uns liegenden Digital Services Act auch zu gucken und da auch politische Forderungen zu formulieren, die ja teilweise auch in der Studie enthalten sind, die teilweise jetzt insbesondere von Kenneth auch nochmal stark gemacht worden sind. Michaela, Sie haben das Wort.
Yes, thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm really happy that we can be here today with so many friends from the affordable housing community, I would say, and for all those who are going for more regulation in the market. Maybe I just start with one point, and that is that cities have always been quite aware since many years now about the problem that short-term touristic rentals cause with their housing markets in general. And I'm very, very delighted to see that new study now tonight, because I think it's a very important contribution to understand how, in fact, these platforms do work and what are their, tricks and what their legal aspects they are using and where they are, where I think where their mindset also is. When we look around Europe, obviously, it's not only about being a city when you are affected about short-term holiday rentals. We also see it, for instance, at the coast of Portugal in the Algarve, or at the I would say even in Croatia, when you look at the coast of Croatia, where a lot of touristic rentals is happening, and where this is also even a business model, especially in countries where you do see that partly the social security net, the social safety net, is not working to provide people with enough income. So this is part of there is a bigger problem to it. But coming back to cities and to Vienna and to our concerns about short-term holiday rentals, we've been dealing with this quite a while now. And we are, as Kenneth said, we are one of these cities that tried to go to court and to get Airbnb to share data after a long time. We've been trying to cooperate with them. We have been trying to cooperate all the platforms that were entering the touristic markets in Vienna. And we see now that in Vienna, 2,000 flats are really lost to the short-term holiday rentals. But we went to court, and one of the issues about going to court I would like to raise here is court cases. They do take a lot of time, and they do take a lot of effort and energy. And we've seen it, for instance, in the last case that Paris was promoting. And until you go from a local maybe court or a regional court to a national court to the European court, it really takes a lot of time. And in the meantime, the short-term holiday rental platforms, they had the time to rearrange themselves in this very fast-moving market. So I think that looking into the court cases is very important, but we also always have to see that this takes time. So better data on what's going on is really one of the key issues that we are demanding in our alliance of cities with our network of big cities as Eurocities. We have been making that point also from the angle of affordable housing community. We are doing it now with the recent report of Kim van Sparentak in the European Parliament. We've been working with Leila Shaibi very much on that. So it's really an important issue to get the data and not to ask for it begging on the door of some short-term holiday rental platform. That's one thing. Their market power really makes the difference, because it's not like a friends group that is sharing something on a blackboard, you know, like students in university looking for flats, and one has a room and the other doesn't, and they like, it's not that. It's really big business. And from the housing perspective, I also want to add that it's always like it's a little bit like the dark trinity of gentrification, financialization, and touristification we do see. And it goes hand in hand, because when you, for instance, look at Lisbon, where nearly 50% of the inner city is now eaten up by touristic platforms and through financialization in the housing sector, this is a catastrophe for real people. So we really need to have the data, but we also need to have the means to regulate. The EU can help us, and this is also part of the study, and I'm quite sure that we're going to discuss this in more detail. But I think that I first want to thank you for really organizing this event and presenting the study, because it really, really makes a difference. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Michaela. Und da Sie Leila schon erwähnt haben, würde ich jetzt auch gleich das Wort an meine Kollegin Leila Shaibi geben. Leila, ich erspare uns allen mein Französisch und werde die Frage in Deutsch an dich richten an dieser Stelle. Und habe dich ja vorhin schon vorgestellt. Wir hatten auch schon gemeinsame Veranstaltungen in Paris, auch mit Katalin. Paris wird ja auch als Fallbeispiel genannt. Wir hatten ja auch den Prozess sozusagen gegen Airbnb, der auch schon erwähnt wurde. Es gibt ja doch ein paar Dinge von den französischen Maßnahmen sozusagen auch zu lernen für andere Städte. Aber wie schätzt du denn im Moment die Situation insgesamt ein in Frankreich? Und es scheint ja so, dass Frankreich etwas entschlossener den digitalen Plattformen ans ich sag mal, Leder geht als andere Mitgliedstaaten, auch bei der Frage zum Beispiel einer Digitalsteuer einen Alleingang gerade wagt. Aber wie ist denn deine Einschätzung der Situation?
Merci Martine. Je me permets de te parler en français, mais étant donné qu'on a la chance d'avoir des interprètes, donc tu peux me parler en allemand, je peux parler en français. J'en profite au passage pour remercier les interprètes pour leur travail lors de ce webinaire. D'abord, un grand merci aussi pour cette étude qui est très intéressante, qui est passionnante et qui nous apporte énormément d'informations qui vont nous être utiles dans la bataille contre Airbnb au Parlement européen. Je voudrais commencer d'abord, puisque comme tu le rappelais tout à l'heure en introduction, Martine, moi je me bats contre les plateformes au Parlement européen et notamment contre d'autres plateformes qui sont différentes d'Airbnb, qui sont Amazon, mais qui sont aussi les plateformes de l'ubérisation, donc Uber et Deliveroo. Alors, on est sur des problématiques différentes, mais je voulais dire que je vois un point commun entre toutes ces plateformes et quelque chose qu'on retrouve dans Airbnb, c'est qu'on a au départ des plateformes qui disent qu'elles sont là pour faire simplement l'intermédiaire entre A et B. Je suis Deliveroo, je vais faire l'intermédiaire entre le restaurant et puis le client qui est confiné dans son appartement et qui veut avoir un repas à domicile. Je suis Uber, je vais faire l'intermédiaire entre le chauffeur et puis la personne qui veut se déplacer dans la ville. Je suis Amazon, je vais dire que je vais faire l'intermédiaire avec ma marketplace entre le commerçant et le client. Et pour Airbnb, à la base, à l'origine, hein, dans la raison d'être, on avait aussi ça. Donc, je suis l'intermédiaire entre le touriste qui vient visiter une ville et puis le locataire ou le propriétaire qui habite et puis qui peut héberger quelqu'un. Sauf que le point commun, moi, que je vois dans ce système de plateformes, c'est que des plateformes qui sont censées faire l'intermédiaire entre A et B, en fait, au final, elles tuent, elles détruisent B. Et on voit ça pour les différentes plateformes qui sont, pour prendre un seul des exemples que je viens de citer, en titre de comparaison, Amazon, par exemple, où il y a eu une plainte de Margaret Vestager, commissaire à la concurrence, où on sait que les produits qui sont vendus sur Amazon, Amazon accumule des données pour ensuite concurrencer les vendeurs de ces produits, pour les remplacer, pour vendre les produits dont elles savent qu'ils marchent bien, en les mettant en valeur parce qu'elles disposent de l'infrastructure de la plateforme. Et c'est pareil pour Airbnb. Airbnb qui est censé faire l'intermédiaire entre le locataire, qui va avoir un petit complément de revenu, hein, pour mettre un peu de beurre dans les épinards, on va louer à un touriste la petite chambre qu'on n'utilise pas ou le week-end, quand on ne va pas être là, on va mettre à disposition notre logement pour un touriste, puis ça va nous mettre du beurre dans les épinards. Eh bien, en fait, on voit à quel point, au final, Airbnb chasse les locataires, détruit les locataires par des processus dont pourrait parler Michaela, je veux dire, qui sont assez connus. C'est-à-dire, d'abord, on va mettre des logements en vente sur Airbnb. En fait, on s'aperçoit que le mythe du locataire qui va mettre quelques jours par mois son logement en vente, tout ça, ce n'est pas la réalité, et que les chiffres le montrent dans l'étude, que la majorité des logements qui sont mis en location sur Airbnb, c'est dans un processus de location de courte durée, mais où en fait c'est l'objet même du logement. Donc du coup, on enlève des logements qui sont sur le marché, on les retire du marché, du coup on réduit l'offre de logements, et la demande, elle, est toujours pareille, ce qui fait que comme il y a un décalage entre l'offre et la demande de logement, eh bien, le prix des logements augmente, hein, c'est la logique de l'offre de logement. Ça fait aussi que comme l'offre de logement augmente, eh bien, on a une augmentation des personnes, et ça on constate dans toutes les capitales européennes, qui habitent dans des conditions de surpeuplement, donc dans des logements qui sont beaucoup trop petits par rapport à la taille du foyer, ou c'est les processus de gentrification qu'on voit dans toutes les capitales européennes, où les logements sont trop chers pour y habiter, même quand on a un travail, donc on va habiter plus loin, et donc les villes sont réservées aux gens qui ont beaucoup de moyens, ou tout simplement, il n'y en a pas de toute façon, il y a moins de logements, donc du coup, les gens sont obligés d'aller acheter ailleurs. Je voulais juste rappeler, parce que donc j'ai été, comme le rappelait Michaela, j'ai travaillé sur le rapport d'initiative sur le logement abordable, où j'étais shadow rapporteur. Le rapport était coordonné par Kim von Sparetak du groupe des Verts. On a fait un bon travail autour de ce rapport en commission emploi affaires sociales, et donc rappeler que dans l'Union européenne, un quart des habitants de l'Union européenne dépensent plus de 40% de ses revenus dans le loyer, donc à un taux d'effort qui est beaucoup trop élevé. Et c'est de la faute aussi des plateformes comme Airbnb. Airbnb contribue, en contribuant à la pénurie de logement par les éléments que j'indiquais juste avant, on contribue à la crise du logement. Et juste, on a vu en fait, avec la crise du Covid-19, avec la crise du coronavirus, comment le fait qu'il y ait, avec le confinement généralisé, moins de touristes qui venaient visiter les villes et donc moins de demandes pour Airbnb, on a vu comment ça avait pour conséquence de faire que les propriétaires qui dédiaient leur logement à la location de courte durée, ils les retiraient des plateformes pour les dédier plutôt à la location de longue durée. Donc, comment en fait finalement, c'était un des rares aspects positifs du confinement et de la crise du Covid-19, ça a eu un effet négatif sur Airbnb. Eh bien, effet négatif sur Airbnb a pour conséquence effet positif en matière d'accès au logement abordable. Voilà, juste donc, oui, tu rappelais, Martine, le contexte donc de la ville de Paris. Donc peut-être avec la décision qui a eu lieu le 22 septembre dernier de la part de la Cour de justice de l'Union européenne, décision très, très, très positive donc dans la lutte contre ces plateformes. C'est souvent compliqué pour le politique à différentes échelles, hein, que ce soit au niveau national, au niveau des villes, de s'opposer aux plateformes. On a des plateformes, donc là c'est le cas d'Airbnb, mais voilà, ça pourrait être le cas d'autres plateformes que j'ai citées auparavant. On a l'impression qu'elles agissent finalement en toute impunité et qu'elles s'en fichent des lois, des règles. Je pense que c'est aussi un des enseignements des études, qu'elles se permettent d'être au-dessus des lois et de pouvoir piétiner les lois qui sont démocratiquement élues et puis de piétiner les décisions des responsables politiques. C'est pour ça que dans ce contexte-là, la décision de la Cour de justice de l'Union européenne du 22 septembre, elle est importante et elle donne de l'enthousiasme, elle donne de l'espoir pour la suite. Je voulais juste peut-être rappeler donc en quoi ça consiste pour celles et ceux qui nous regardent et qui n'ont peut-être pas toutes les informations. Donc en France, il y a la limitation quand un logement est mis sur Airbnb, on ne peut pas le mettre plus de 120 jours par an sur Airbnb. Et puis, il faut que ce soit votre résidence principale. C'est-à-dire, bon, à la base, c'est ce que c'est censé être la vocation originelle de Airbnb. Mais bon, voilà. Donc, la loi dit ça. Et en plus, la ville de Paris avait décidé que quand on veut mettre un logement, le dédier à la location de courte durée, donc c'est-à-dire au-delà des 120 jours par an, eh bien, il fallait faire une demande d'autorisation préalable parce qu'il y avait un changement d'usage du logement. Il passait de location normale à location de courte durée. Donc, il fallait faire une demande d'autorisation et être soumis à un système de compensation. C'est-à-dire que si vous mettez un logement en location de courte durée sur Airbnb, vous deviez, en contrepartie, comme vous retirez du logement de la location, du circuit de la location classique, eh ben, vous devez proposer en contrepartie le changement d'usage d'un immeuble ou d'un espace, d'un local de bureau en logement à proportion du logement que vous retirez de la vente de longue durée. Il y a des propriétaires qui ont été mécontents de ça et donc qui ont dit, mais écoutez, de toute façon, ça, c'est pas conforme au droit de l'Union européenne. Il y a notamment une directive de 2006 qui est la directive services qui dit que, eh bien, on a le droit, il y a une liberté de proposer des services en Union européenne. Ils se sont servis de ça pour faire un recours auprès de la Cour de justice de l'Union européenne. Et bien donc, on a eu donc la décision du 22 septembre 2020, du 22 septembre dernier. La Cour de justice de l'Union européenne a dit non, non, non. La ville de Paris est en droit de demander une autorisation préalable et une compensation à partir du moment où il y a un motif d'intérêt général. Et le fait de lutter contre la crise du logement pour le maintien d'un logement abordable et de lutter contre la pénurie de logement, c'est un motif d'intérêt général. Donc, la ville de Paris est tout à fait en droit de mettre en place ce genre de dispositions. Donc, c'est une grande, grande victoire dans la lutte contre l'impunité d'Airbnb. Je voudrais juste relativiser aussi en disant que bon, il y a ce système de compensation. La Cour de justice de l'Union européenne dit qu'il doit être proportionné. On attend une audition de la Cour de cassation en janvier pour avoir plus d'informations sur ce que signifie proportionné, mais c'est quand même une grande avancée en matière de décision de justice. Par rapport à l'autre question que tu me posais, Martine, sur la taxe numérique, donc qui fait écho à la proposition de taxe GAFAM qui devait avoir lieu au sein de l'Union européenne, qui finalement n'a pas abouti. Alors, certes, c'est aussi un pas en avant, mais je voudrais quand même relativiser et dire qu'on a un gouvernement en France qui est un petit peu l'ami des plateformes, notamment un ami d'Uber, de Deliveroo et puis des GAFAM. Et donc, même si c'est un premier pas, c'est quand même des montants très, très minimes et plutôt symboliques, en fait, que réellement efficaces et opérants. Mais c'est symbolique, je pense que ça fait quand même écho au fait qu'il y a un ras-le-bol général de la part des citoyens et des citoyennes, qu'on est dans une période où, voilà, on est en crise, tout le monde prend ses responsabilités, Et puis, c'est devenu intolérable, en fait, je crois, dans l'opinion publique, que des plateformes numériques agissent en toute impunité, piétinent les lois. On n'en a pas parlé ce soir, mais voilà, la question des impôts, en fait, ne paye pas on va certainement aborder le sujet plus en détail, mais le fait que, ben voilà, on a des commerçants, des entreprises nationales qui vont payer des impôts, participent au commun pour payer des services publics, des hôpitaux dont on a tant besoin en ce moment. Et c'est devenu de plus en plus insupportable dans ce contexte-là qu'on ait des sociétés comme Airbnb qui profitent du fait qu'il n'y a pas d'harmonisation fiscale en Union européenne pour ne pas mettre leur part de contribution au pot commun pour financer les services publics. Et je crois que ce ras-le-bol-là, dans la part de la population, c'est aussi quelque chose qui nous donne du poids dans le rapport de force. Merci.
Vielen Dank, Leila. Wir werden das in der Diskussion noch vertiefen. Ich würde aber trotzdem direkt zu Katalin jetzt an der Stelle gehen. Katalin, Berlin hat ja einen Mietendeckel eingeführt. Ich finde, eines der wirklich interessantesten wohnungspolitischen Projekte, die derzeit in der EU stattfinden. Es ist auch ein großer Erfolg, von dem die Mieterinnen und Mieter ja massiv profitieren auch. Mieten de facto gesenkt werden im großen Maßstab. Vielleicht kannst du uns erstens dazu was sagen, also welche wohnungspolitischen Maßnahmen im Sinne und im Interesse der Mieterinnen und Mieter Berlin übernimmt. Und wenn wir über Airbnb diskutieren, wird ja auch immer wieder über ein Zweckentfremdungsverbot gesprochen. Und das wären meine beiden Fragen an dich, dass du dich zu diesen beiden Punkten nochmal äußerst.
Vielen Dank, Martin. Vielen Dank für die schöne Einladung. Und ich bin sehr froh, dass wir heute hier zusammenkommen in dieser neuen Allianz aus Datenaktivismus, Datenpolitik und Wohnraumversorgungspolitik, also Wohnungsfragen und Mietenfragen zusammen mit diesen Datenfragen zu diskutieren. Denn ich glaube, das soll schon gesagt sein, dass dieses Wohnen als die alte und neue soziale Frage jetzt sich auch anders stellt. Also wie die Regulierung des Wohnens, der Wohnungspolitik im digitalen Zeitalter funktionieren muss, darum muss es uns gehen, denn im 20. Jahrhundert wurde ja das Wohnen sehr strikt reguliert. In Deutschland zumindest gab es sehr scharfe Wohnraumschutzgesetze, die in den vergangenen 30 Jahren dem Neoliberalismus zum Opfer fielen. Und die Mieterrechte und die Wohnraumschutzgesetze wurden in den letzten 30 Jahren massiv kaputt gemacht, geschliffen. Und deswegen stellt sich die Frage natürlich heute, wie bekommen wir eigentlich wieder stärkere Wohnraumschutzgesetze? Und das aber vor allem für neue Anforderungen in einem digitalen Zeitalter. Ich will ganz kurz, bevor ich zum Mietendeckel komme, nochmal sagen, dass ich sehr dankbar bin über die Studie und auch die Aussagen. Murray, du hattest gesagt, die Legende der Zusammenarbeit von Airbnb mit den Städten muss aufgedeckt werden. Das finde ich richtig gut. Und Kenneth, du hattest auch nochmal herausgestellt, dass es eben so ist, dass Airbnb die Regeln vorgibt. Darauf würde ich gerne eingehen. Meine These, die ich voranstellen möchte, ist schon, ich glaube, dass wir heute über Wohnraumfinanzialisierung, also die finanzmarktorientierte Verwertung von Wohnraum durch digitalisierte Dienstleistungen vor Augen haben, wenn wir über Airbnb reden. Wir reden über eine ganz große neue Branche, in der digitale Anwendungen für Mieterüberwachung, Datentracking zur sozusagen weiteren Wohnraumverwertung angeboten werden, die Datenrechte mit den Füßen treten, die Mieterrechte mit den Füßen treten. Wir reden also über den ganzen Bereich PropTech, Property Technologies. Und Airbnb ist sozusagen nur der Anfang eines sehr, sehr großen neuen Marktes, der sich da auftut unter der Agenda der sogenannten Smart City. Ich will auch voranstellen, dass Airbnb vor allem deshalb so mächtig ist, weil eben sie auch mit jedem illegalen Angebot Geld verdienen. Also das Motiv von Airbnb, Regeln zu brechen, nationale, internationale und lokale Regeln zu brechen, ist sehr einfach, denn mit jedem illegalen Angebot verdient der Konzern und wird höher bewertet an der Börse, wenn er dann irgendwann an der Börse ist. Das heißt, ich will auch noch mal zusammenfassen zu dem, auch wie ihr die Studie dargelegt habt. Airbnb legt unsere Behörden lahm und unsere Gerichte. Das heißt, Martin, zu der Frage auch noch mal, wie freuen wir uns eigentlich über diese Gerichtsprozesse, also die internationalen Gerichtsprozesse, die am EuGH laufen, an den nationalen Gerichten, die sind ja wie Krimis. Und natürlich verfolge ich das mit Hochspannung, viele von uns verfolgen das. Aber man muss ja sagen, dass diese Millionenklagen immer nur Zeitverzögerung sind. Das ist ja eine totale Hinhaltetaktik, Salamitaktik. Und am Ende muss man sagen, ist das Geschäftsmodell von Airbnb so aufgestellt, dass wir selbst mit der härtesten Millionenklage meist nicht den Konzern treffen. Und das ist eine Frage, die muss uns beschäftigen. Wie schaffen wir es eigentlich, das Geschäftsmodell des Konzerns so zu treffen, dass es ihm ins Markt geht? Und da, glaube ich, ist tatsächlich die Datenpolitik der Länder, der Regionen und des Konzerns der Schlüssel. Ich möchte die Verbindung gerne herstellen zum Mietendeckel. Wir haben jetzt in Berlin tatsächlich für 5 Jahre befristet den Mietendeckel eingeführt, ein nationales Mietenregulierungsinstrument. Auch da nochmal der Bezug zu meinem Eingang. Früher hatten wir sehr scharfe Wohnraumschutzgesetze und Mietregulierung. Früher war das ganz normal, Mieten zu regulieren. Deswegen machen wir das jetzt einfach wieder. Das ist also nichts Kommunistisches, es ist auch nichts besonders Exotisches. Mietenregulierung gibt es in vielen Ländern der Welt und gab es früher auch. Die Verbindung zum Mietendeckel in Berlin ist tatsächlich der Erfinder des Mietendeckels, nämlich Peter Weber. Peter Weber ist ein bekannter Jurist, der in Berlin also nicht nur den Mietendeckel erfunden hat, sondern seinerzeit mich auch beraten hatte für das Zweckentfremdungsverbotsgesetz. In Berlin wird Airbnb über ein Gesetz reguliert, ein Ordnungsgesetz. Das nennt sich Zweckentfremdungsverbotsgesetz. Das heißt, es verbietet die zweckfremde Nutzung von Wohnraum zu anderen als Wohnzwecken. Würde man jetzt übersetzen als Anti-Airbnb-Gesetz. Dieses Gesetz, Murray, da hattest es schon gesagt, war 2016 schon erlassen worden, aber noch ein sehr zahnloses Gesetz. Deswegen haben wir als linke Regierung das dann 2018 nach dem Regierungswechsel verschärft. Ich habe da aus einer Minderheitenposition für ein sehr striktes Gesetz an der Seite des Mietendeckels, des späteren Mietendeckelerfinders Peter Weber, für ein sehr striktes Anti-Airbnb-Gesetz gestritten. Und ich sage das deswegen, weil der Peter Weber derjenige war, der damals schon gesagt hat, dass diese Regelung des Home-Sharings eine absolute Lüge ist, weil der Begriff des Homesharings sich gar nicht untersetzen lässt mit der juristischen Definition des Wohnens. Denn Wohnen muss ja definierbar sein. Man muss ja ein Hotel von einer Wohnung unterscheiden können, um es mal platt zu sagen. Und deswegen ist die juristische Definition zur Feststellung der Wohnnutzung ganz einfach die Qualität der Häuslichkeit. Die Qualität der Häuslichkeit, das klingt jetzt banal, ist aber wichtig, weil die Frage, wie setzen wir eigentlich Wohnraumschutz um und wie schaffen wir es, die massenhafte Touristifizierung und Verwertung von Airbnb in den Nachbarschaften zurückzudrängen. Und da kommen wir jetzt zu einem meiner Lieblingsthemen. Das werden wir nicht schaffen, indem Mitarbeiterinnen der Ordnungsbehörden, Verwaltungsmitarbeiterinnen durch die Nachbarschaften gehen und schauen, welche Gardine danach aussieht, als wäre dahinter eine Ferienwohnung versteckt. Wir werden es auch nicht schaffen, indem Verwaltungsmitarbeitern nach Schlössern, nach Vorhängeschlössern suchen, in denen Schlüssel versteckt sind, was auch also so eine bekannte Airbnb-Praxis ist. Das heißt, wir müssen ran an die Daten und deswegen bin ich sehr froh über eure klaren Aussagen, Murray und Kenneth. Wir müssen ran an die Daten, denn nur so schaffen wir es, die Steuervermeidungspolitik von Airbnb zu sanktionieren. Mehrere Millionen entgehen im Jahr schätzungsweise dem Land Berlin durch Airbnb in Fragen der Übernachtungssteuer, in Fragen der Umsatzsteuer. Das heißt, es ist also auch eine Frage der Steuergerechtigkeit, die sich hier stellt. Und da sage ich ja immer, eigentlich müsste es die Finanzbehörde machen. Also kein Unternehmen hat so viel Angst vor anderen wie vor der Finanzbehörde. Deswegen bin ich ja dafür, dass Airbnb von dem Finanzamt reguliert wird. Darüber streite ich mich auch mit dem Finanzsenator. Aber kommen wir zu den letzten Punkten. Zu der Frage, wieso ist die Durchsetzung des Gesetzes so schwer? Es wurde gesagt, das, was Airbnb den Städten anbietet, ist ein Rundum-Paket, nämlich eine sogenannte Tageregelung, die eingeführt werden soll, die das handhabbar machen soll, dass nicht zu viele Kurzzeitvermietungen passieren. Die ist Schrott. Das muss man einfach lassen. Das ist einfach ganz schlecht, denn diese Tageregelung macht auch die Ordnungsgesetze angreifbar. Deswegen haben wir uns fast ganz gegen eine Tageregelung in Berlin entschieden. Wir haben es nicht ganz geschafft. Es gibt jetzt immer noch eine abgeschwächte Variante. Aber diese Tageregelung, die muss raus, denn man kann niemals sagen, dass 90 Tage Kurzzeitvermietung im Jahr irgendwie lebensnah für normale Berlinerinnen und Berliner sind. Dann ist es so, dass diese Registriernummer, ihr habt es schon gesagt, wirklich raus muss. Diese Registriernummer ist eine reine Konzernerfindung, die dem Staat nichts bringt. Wir müssen im Einzelfall entscheiden. In Berlin gilt, grundsätzlich sind Kurzzeitvermietungen verboten und jeder, der kurzzeitig seine Wohnung vermieten möchte, muss sich das genehmigen lassen. Warum haben wir das so strikt gehandhabt? Weil es ist doch klar, dass ich trotzdem entscheiden kann, ob ich ab und zu mal jemanden bei mir auf der Couch übernachten lasse. Das heißt, eine Zweckentfremdung von Wohnraum liegt nicht vor. Eine zweckfremde Nutzung von Wohnraum liegt nicht vor, wenn jemand bei mir auf der Couch übernachtet. Und insofern sind das die 3 Punkte, die mir wichtig sind, wo man sagen muss, das, was Airbnb den Städten anbietet, ist kein Angebot, das ist ein schlechtes Angebot, das muss man ablehnen. Und das, was wir brauchen, ist die Datentransparenz. Wir müssen dafür sorgen, dass Airbnb verpflichtet wird, die illegalen Angebote selber von der Plattform zu nehmen und ansonsten dafür haftbar gemacht wird, wenn die illegalen Angebote bleiben. Und wir brauchen ein Wohnungskataster. Wir brauchen dringend ein Wohnungskataster, denn wenn wir ein Wohnungskataster haben, dann brauchen wir auch kein Mietwohnungskataster mehr. Und insofern ist es als allerletztes noch wichtig, dass die regionalen Durchsetzungsbehörden, dass die staatlichen Behörden mit viel Geld ausgestattet werden, damit sie die teuren Klageverfahren gegen Airbnb auch bestreiten können. Dankeschön.
Vielen Dank, Katalin. Und die letzte Rednerin jetzt in dieser Runde zunächst wird Barbara Steenbergen sein. Barbara, du vertrittst ja mit der internationalen Mieterinnengewerkschaft nicht nur Europäerinnen und Europäer, sondern weltweit quasi seid ihr aktiv. Erste Frage, gibt es denn außerhalb Europas etwas für uns zu lernen, was wir uns zu Herzen nehmen sollten? Ich meine jetzt nicht nur Best Practices, sondern auch Lessons learned. Also wenn auch mal was schief geht, wo wir wissen, das sollten wir auf jeden Fall vermeiden. Aber was sind denn Dinge, die wir in jedem Fall in unserer politischen Debatte aus anderen Weltregionen lernen können? Und die zweite Frage, was würdest du dir aus deiner Sicht als Vertreterin der Mieterinnen denn wünschen, was sich konkret im DSA, und dann sind ja nun einige Punkte schon angesprochen worden, aber dann auch widerspiegelt, weil wir ja nun in die Verhandlungen eintreten und ich nehme an, wir da auch hin und wieder reden werden miteinander. Das hoffe ich zumindest sehr.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martin, and everybody for the invitation. A very interesting seminar. I learned a lot, thanks to the experts. Well, what can we learn from the international, let's say, fight against Airbnb, illegal Airbnbs? It has been said before, it is too hard for every single city to fight their own fight against these big platforms. And it is the time that cities unite in a way and try to get some common regulation. Otherwise, you will spend years in front of the court and you do not know what will happen at the end, how the judges will decide, and business goes on. I think nobody will deny that Airbnb and all the other short-term rental platforms, they are big business now. We are actually expecting now the stock launch of Airbnb, I guess tomorrow. And we also know it from our experts who did the case studies. It is not just, let's say, the poor tenant renting out one single room in order to get a little bit of more money into his pocket. This is big business, which is done mainly and more by commercial investors. And this, I think, asks for regulation. I am a friend of regulation. This is what we also learned from the US regions, where Airbnb actually was invented. I give you my airbed and a small breakfast. So what we learned, for instance, from San Francisco and New York City is this fight lasts too long. You can get a good judge who helps you, but on the other hand, then Airbnb is suing you again, and you can end up at the other side. So I do think as Europe, we do have a strong moment now to get the regulation done. The Digital Services Act. It would be, let's say, in the best of all cases, it would be the ideal situation. But being quite long in European legislation now when it comes to housing market questions, and also, let's say, fights of David against Goliath, I am a little bit reluctant or cautious. Let me say I am cautious. I give you an example. We do have the regulation on state aid for social housing. It is part of the state aid packages of the Commission, also of Mrs. Vestager, the Commissioner, taking care of the internal market. And in this state aid package, we also do have a very strange regulation saying social housing can only be provided for the poorest of the poor, socially disadvantaged households, and otherwise it is not in line with the state aid regulation of the European Commission. Dear colleagues, we are fighting this regulation, who is launched by some interest group of private housing developers. We are fighting this regulation for more than 12 years, and we did not succeed. So if you want to do something in the Digital Services Act, do it well. I think it is the moment, and get the right majorities. You will not have a lot of friends when you do that. And so I think if we have the majority in European Parliament to have a strong regulation, let's go for it. It's the chance now, because this is the only way, in a way, to get rid of this more and more commercial use of Airbnb and other short-term rentals. Let me be very clear. This is a massive extraction of affordable housing from all housing markets. And we do not have enough affordable housing stock. So why should we endanger the small stock that is still resting by commercial activities like those short-term rentals? It makes no sense at all. And that was, for me, a very happy day when I heard about the judgment in Paris, that the public interest to have more affordable housing in your market is higher than the interest of Airbnb to have commercial successes in your city. And this is a precedent, and this is a good thing. But again, if you go to court, it can, in another city, it can be another judgment. So yes, if there is a chance to get the right majority, to get the right regulation now in the Digital Services Act, go for it. If you see it's not working and you see that other powers representing the free flow of capital on the internal market of the European Union, they are stronger, then be aware what can happen, because it happened to us and we are fighting against this crazy regulation in our internal market law against social housing for 12 years. And believe me, we are big fighters, the tenants union, but we are still not there. Second point, don't think about Airbnb as a single thing. Airbnb is part, and this has also been said by Mrs. Michaela Kawa before, is part of the financialization of the housing markets worldwide. we do work together with many international actors. For instance, Lailani Farah, the rapporteur for the right to housing at the United Nations, she launched the initiative, The Shift, where we take a look at what is happening with our housing market. Who is playing there? What are they doing? Where is the cash flow? Where is the money coming from? And where is it going to? And I think this is something that we also have to regulate, or at least guarantee more transparency at the European market. We, the International Union of Tenants, we are following the big investments of big investment firms, entering the markets, buying the affordable public housing stock and selling it on with a massive profit. But sometimes we do not even know who are the actors. Sometimes one of our members, they ask, I don't know who is my landlord. I have a problem with my apartment. Who is this? And then we have to say, sorry, at the moment we cannot even check it. It has been traded 4 or 5 times. We do not know who is your landlord. Sometimes we end up at the Cayman Islands. Sometimes we end up at a consortium from Cyprus, Luxembourg, and Greece. It is impossible what is happening now, the financialization of the markets. It is really threatening for all the people who rent and to depend on their landlords. And I do think it is time, in order to put an EU-wide transparency register for real estate transactions into force, in order to fight this big financialization, to fight speculation, and do not forget, to fight money laundering and tax evasion. I think this is a big issue. So at the moment, yeah, we have to do something in the Digital Services Act, if you get the majorities, ladies and gentlemen, but take a wider look. Take a look how we can really bring transparency into all these transactions that we have, not only Airbnb. So this as a start, and I'm happy to debate with you further on.
Thank you, Barbara. And exactly now is also the time to start the debate with the participants. Please, participants, send us your questions by writing them into the chat function. I've already received a request to take the floor from Friederike Meyer, and I would ask her to open her mic and ask her question. In the meantime, I can raise another question until Friederike Meyer can take the floor. Then I don't know if there is a technical problem or not, but there's another question from Axel Fries, and I would give this question to Murray and also to Michaela Kauer. Might tax revenues, is the question, might tax revenues from Airbnb hosts for cities be a reason for some reluctance to act? I guess this refers to the local authorities, that they are reluctant to act. And are data available on such cities' tax revenues, and are they significant?
I might start by answering that. I think definitely tax revenues are an issue, especially in these times where of COVID, where we don't just have health impacts, but we also have economic impacts of the budgets of our cities. I think it depends on the city. For example, in New York City, they've said we are not going to accept taxes while there is such an impact on our housing, and they would basically be accepting taxes on illegal activity. But New York City has a billions of dollar budget, I have seen some discussions in other localities where the argument used would be the revenue lost from taxes if regulations were enacted. For example, that was the argument used in Washington, D.C. How much tax revenue would you lose if you restrict the activity? So I think it definitely is an issue. I haven't seen that much tax data available in many, in most cities that is not available. Sometimes the agreements between the platforms and the cities are confidential, and there's no reporting on that. You can do some rough estimates based on the activity and the data, and I would expect that some researchers are looking into this question, but I haven't seen that much published yet.
Yeah, maybe I can share a little bit from Vienna on that. We know that we have reached an agreement with 12 platforms, tourist accommodation platforms, who are reporting data now regularly on the basis of the Viennese Tourism Promotion Act, which is in fact the legal basis of the city of Vienna to collect taxes for hosts of Airbnb, of short-term rental apartments. But again, it's Airbnb not providing us with data and refusing to accept any national or local or regional law on that. So it's really, it's an issue about data. And if you don't have the data, you will not be able to get the taxes. And even if it's only a small share of our total income into the Vienna budget, I would say, still tourism tax in a city like Vienna is an important contribution. And the things that are coming from the short-term holiday rentals are absolutely important as well. But Airbnb is the one that, again, refuses to give us the data.
All right. Thank you for answering this question. I would again invite the participants to write down their questions in the chat function, because obviously it is not possible for them to open their mics and to raise the questions directly. I have another question received, and I would like to read it out loud, first of all, and then Leila, Katalin, and Barbara answering it. It was Commissioner Vestager met with many mayors in Europe. This is well known and documented in your interviews. She did then express afterwards that she wants to collaborate better also with local authorities. But what was your impression from the side of local authorities? Will there actually be some movement on the side of the Commission in order to better regulate the housing market or not? Barbara, maybe you would like to take the floor first, or go first, and then Katalin, and then Leila.
Yes, with pleasure, Martin. Yeah, as I told you before, we are fighting with the DG Competition since years in order to get rid of really harmful regulations of the housing market, especially for affordable and social housing. So since 12 years, we are in close contact with DG Competition, and we have seen many commissioners coming and going. And we were, I think, very, very unified. I have to mention again the EU Partnership for Affordable Housing, which is coordinated by one of the ladies here on the panel, Michaela Kauer. And we said to the Commission, get rid of the narrow target group definition of social housing in your internal market package and the state aid regulations. And Mrs. Vestager managed to answer, not at all. The commissioners before managed to do nothing. 12 years of fight. So again, be careful if you go to DG Competition, it can work the other way. Because they are really, they are defending the internal open market and the free flow of capital. That's the way it is. So I would be very careful if we do something at European level, but on the other hand, as a really optimistical person, I think we can make it together, and this is the point, together with the alliance of cities. And it doesn't make sense if you visit cities and drink a coffee with the mayor, as Mrs. Vestager is doing it. It makes sense if you sit on the table and say, okay, that is the future regulation. And allow me a question, I take the liberty. The commissioner is not an official. The commissioner has the possibility to talk in a political way. And even if the Digital Services Act now is in the made, then the commissioner can come and talk to us. So I do see it also as a sign that nobody showed up from DG Competition today.
Yes, that's right. That is a clear political sign. I agree. Katalin, please.
Ja, ich würde sagen, also meine Hoffnung auf eine konservative Kommission, dass sie im Sinne der Mieterinnen und Mieter den finanzgetriebenen Wohnungsmarkt re-reguliert, sind gleich 0. Also ich habe keine Hoffnung, dass diese Kommission etwas im Sinne der Wohnraumschutzpolitik tut. Und ich habe ja heute sehr deutlich gemacht, dass aus meiner Sicht das Thema der starken öffentlichen Wohnungspolitik, Wohnraumversorgungspolitik tatsächlich das große Überthema ist, mit dem wir es hier zu tun haben. Die Plattformpolitik ist da eben ein Teil davon. Aus meiner Sicht ist es wichtig, dass wir jetzt gemeinsam als Linke da auch in diesem Prozess um den DSA schauen, dass die Plattformen nicht die ganze Zeit als der wirtschaftliche Fortschritt und die Zukunft sozusagen die Zukunft der Wirtschaft Entrepreneurs sozusagen gepriesen werden, sondern dass klar wird, dass diese Form der Wohnraumverwertung eben eine massive Kannibalisierung der Wohnungssituation als einer sozialen Daseinsvorsorge zur Folge hat und dass das deswegen gar nicht miteinander in Einklang steht und dass die nationalen Wohnraumschutzgesetze, die regionalen Wohnraumschutzgesetze deswegen viel höhere Priorität haben. In Berlin werden wir jetzt unser Wohnraumschutzgesetz, die Zweckentfremdung, zeitgleich zum Mietendeckel nochmal novellieren. Wir wollen es nochmal verschärfen und aus meiner Sicht kann man nur gar nicht scharf genug gegen Plattformanbieter wie Airbnb agieren. Dazu gehört aber auch, dass man Alternativen auch fördert. Wir reden hier über Plattformgenossenschaften wie AIRBNB, die als Alternative zu Airbnb ja auch wichtig sind zu unterstützen. Und insofern muss es aus meiner Sicht vor allem darum gehen, die ganze Wohnraumversorgungspolitik wieder neu aufzubauen in den Mitgliedsländern. In Deutschland, wie gesagt, haben wir da in den letzten 30 Jahren viel kaputt gemacht. Und jetzt geht es darum, auch auf Berliner Ebene wieder eine sehr starke Reregulierung der Wohnungspolitik hinzubekommen. Danke.
Ich danke dir. Leila, würdest du auch kurz nochmal aus Pariser Sicht, also jetzt aus französischer Sicht, die Frage beantworten?
Alors moi, je suis pas élue locale, donc je suis pas élue à la mairie de Paris, donc malheureusement, je n'ai pas d'informations sur la rencontre entre Anne Hidalgo, la maire de Paris, et la Commission européenne. Je suis pas dans les petits papiers. Par contre, je voudrais dire un mot en fait sur le lien qu'il peut y avoir entre les décisions prises par la Commission européenne et puis les politiques du logement et la lutte contre le mal logement, parce que c'est des choses qu'on a essayé de faire avancer. Et en lien d'ailleurs avec Barbara, en lien avec Michaela, puis en lien avec l'ensemble des acteurs qui luttent pour défendre le droit des locataires et contre la crise du logement à Bruxelles, dans le cadre du rapport d'initiative donc pour un logement abordable. Et alors l'Union européenne n'a pas de compétences directes en matière de logement, mais par contre elle a différents leviers d'action pour agir pour un logement abordable. Et notamment parmi nous les choses qui... Alors Évidemment, vu le rapport de force actuel, qui ne sont pas gagnés, mais qu'on pense qu'il y a possibilité d'avancer et de faire en sorte que l'Union européenne aide à mettre en place un logement abordable. Vous savez, il y a par exemple, il y a un gros travail à faire et où il y a des avancées, il me semble, sur tout ce qui concerne les investissements publics d'un État, par exemple, en faveur du logement abordable, du logement public. Et ça, quand on veut investir, quand un État veut investir dans le logement public, dans le logement abordable, souvent, il a des obstacles qui viennent de l'Union européenne. Il y a notamment, par exemple, la règle des 3%, des critères de Maastricht, mais on a vu ces derniers temps, avec la crise du coronavirus, que ces règles dont on a l'impression qu'elles sont gravées dans le marbre, on peut en fait les faire bouger. Et donc nous, on pense que l'investissement dans le logement, parce que notamment la priorité en ce moment, ça doit être de réparer les conséquences sociales de la crise sanitaire qu'on vit. Et donc l'investissement dans le logement doit pouvoir sortir de la règle des 3%. Par ailleurs, et là-dessus, j'ai plutôt une note d'optimisme, c'est que, vous savez, il y a une espèce de dogme dans l'Union européenne, la façon dont elle est organisée, c'est le dogme de la concurrence. Et en fait, il y a des pays, je pense aux Pays-Bas, en 2011, les Pays-Bas ont été sanctionnés par la Commission européenne sous prétexte que quand ils investissaient dans le logement abordable, quand l'État des Pays-Bas hollandais investissaient dans le logement public, on leur disait attention, vous investissez dans le logement abordable, mais pas uniquement le logement social pour les plus pauvres. Vous avez une définition trop large du logement abordable, vous voulez même construire du logement social pour les classes moyennes et pas uniquement pour les catégories les plus pauvres. Et donc ça, c'est contraire aux règles de la concurrence. Ça fait concurrence avec le parc privé de logement, avec le propriétaire immobilier qui loue son logement dans le parc privé sans avoir, lui, de subvention. Donc, c'est contraire aux règles de l'Union européenne. Donc, on vous met une amende. Et ça, là-dessus, c'est pour ça qu'un des combats qu'on a menés dans le cadre de ce rapport d'initiative au Parlement sur le logement, c'est de faire en sorte, justement, à la fois qu'on élargisse le public du logement abordable, parce qu'actuellement, la crise du logement ne touche pas que les pauvres, mais il y a toute une catégorie de la population qui, avant, pouvait avoir un logement dans le parc privé, mais du fait de la baisse des revenus, de l'augmentation des loyers dans le parc privé, ne peut plus avoir un logement dans le parc privé, et donc on doit leur permettre d'accéder au logement abordable. Et donc il y a tout un travail qui a été fait là-dessus, et moi j'ai l'impression, mais après moi je ne suis pas au Parlement européen depuis longtemps, c'est mon premier mandat, donc d'autres ici seront plus à même de le confirmer, mais qu'il y a dû bouger quand même, que c'est comme l'histoire de la règle des 3%, que là on s'aperçoit de l'absurdité de certains dogmes, et que c'est en train de bouger, en fait. Donc, c'est plutôt positif.
Vielen Dank, Leila. Und Michaela hatte jetzt auch nochmal an dieser Stelle um das Wort gebeten. Und danach würde ich eine Frage an Kenneth richten. Aber erst Michaela und danach richte ich.
Yeah. No, with regard to the Commission and cities, or especially this Commission and cities, I think that, you take the United States as a role model for once, with a new president-elect. Joe Biden just met with the mayors of the biggest US cities. And we're still waiting for an invitation of Mrs. von der Leyen to do the same thing. And it would just be very lovely and I think helpful if, for instance, you as MEPs could just pose the question, when, dear Mrs. von der Leyen, are you going to meet, for instance, with the mayors of the EU capital cities? Because all the things that you are now have you written in your lovely program for 2021, which, by the way, does not contain one time the word cities. But okay, when are you going to meet with all these mayors who are supposed to deliver on these important projects? So, 72 to 75% of the European population is living in cities, and the European Commission does not have an institutionalized dialogue with cities and mayors. So I guess that going that way would be really helpful, and maybe one of the three of you could just simply ask this question to the Commission President once.
Das nehmen wir uns als Hausaufgabe mit aus diesem Treffen, und Leila und ich werden uns absprechen, wer die Frage stellt, aber wir werden sie gern stellen. Jetzt habe ich eine Frage aus dem Chat für Kenneth erhalten. Kenneth, you mentioned this briefly in your presentation today, but someone from the participants would like to ask again in more detail in your study on page 71. Wait, I need to switch off the. All right. Original. All right. So I hope you can hear me now. I've been translated. All right. So Kenneth, you mentioned this earlier today in your presentation, but the participants would like to know in more detail your study on page 71, these what is needed chapter. You suggest that it would be best if Airbnb would not be included in the Digital Services Act. However, do you not see that we now have a chance to regulate on European level rather than excluding Airbnb from the regulation, and thus having each city fight by itself again, and thus losing valuable resources?
Right. The discussion that we're about to have about the Digital Services Act in Europe is not about how cities should regulate short-term rental platforms and their impact on affordable housing. Those are issues that cities will have to deal with first and foremost by themselves. They adopt the local rules about what restrictions should be enforced. They have the competence to do that. I doubt very much that the European Union would have the mandate or the competence or the skills to do that on behalf of cities. What the Digital Services Act is about how we regulate or how we do not regulate platforms. It's the successor to a directive called the e-commerce directive. And we're in the area of the kind of laws that Murray calls them shielding laws. From the outset, it's about how to make sure that there are clear rules on the European levels about how platforms are regulated, clear rules that from the outset are supposed to make sure that this particular economic sector thrives. So don't expect anything from the Commission that will go deeply into the housing situation in Vienna or Rome. It's not about that. It's about what rights, but what it is about is it's about what tools can cities use to implement or to enforce the decisions that they have made about short-term rental platforms operations in their city. Which is why when you look at the demands from European cities from all over, the essence of the demands are, we would like to have the right to be able to do this or that to enforce the rules that we have adopted. So the kind of I get the implication, or I get the idea behind the question, but this is simply not the kind of European law that we're about to discuss. It doesn't fit logically into the concept. So the reason why Murray and I mentioned the option of actually leaving the Airbnb out is because once the short-term rental platforms are not covered by this directive, the limitation on cities' ability to regulate will then vanish. It doesn't mean that there will be no limitations, because there are rules of general European law, but the limitations that we fear the most, so about access to data and having to run court cases in other countries and so forth, they will not be a factor if Airbnb and other platforms are not covered by the directive. The only reason why that Airbnb is now clearly covered by the e-commerce directive, it owes to some moves by the Commission, but mainly a decision of the European Court of Justice. If we were to have a directive that would go for excluding the short-term rental platforms, they would not be covered. So, I mean, legally, it's not a big deal. It's actually pretty straightforward. Whether it's easy politically, that I mean, I don't walk around the corridors of the European Parliament on a daily basis. I think a lot of cities would actually prefer to have it that way. But whether it flies at European level, I don't know. But I think it's worth putting it on the table, because in other cases, such as Uber, it has actually solved a lot of problems that Uber is not covered by the e-commerce directive. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for expressing your concerns. I have another question that also goes to Kenneth. You published a short while ago a study on big tech's lobby and the big tech's lobby effort on the DSA. And was there anything surprising for you? What did you find out apart from big tech spending a lot of money in order to influence the legislation?
Did I publish a study on? I'm actually not quite sure, but I can tell you about the position of the platforms towards the DSA. And for Airbnb, it's very straightforward. They would like to retain the privileges that they enjoy under the e-commerce directive. They want them to be repeated. Then on top of that, they throw in, they want to see the development of a new layer of what would you call it? A new European body that would ensure that this directive is implemented in the same way all over Europe. And the reason why they do that, of course, is because they see they eye a victory with the Digital Services Act. Once that is in place, they want to ensure enforcement. They want a kind of legal act that will allow them to escape all the battles that they are now having with cities. They want to be able to turn their attention to one single European body that will ensure uniform application of the privileges they enjoy under the directive. As for other platforms, let's not go into the big five. That's probably for another meeting. But for Uber, I found it interesting that some of the defeats that Uber has suffered over the past couple of years, they now eye an opportunity to reverse them. First and foremost, Uber is hoping for them to be fully covered under the Digital Services Act, which would then lead to another messy situation around the right to require, for instance, an authorization from Uber. So the Digital Services Act could represent a serious threat when it comes to Uber.
All right. Thank you, Kenneth, for answering. Also, this question means for Leila and other lawmakers like me to be very vigilant about what is going on there with the legislative proposal coming from the Commission. Murray, I have a question for you from Vincent Aulnay, and he's asking, today Airbnb has opened a new platform.org, might be website, and this is to help people in natural catastrophes. For example, do you think this is social washing, kind of branding campaign maybe for Airbnb?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it is. Airbnb has this appearance of a progressive or a liberal, as we call it in the US, a liberal progressive company. And I'm sure many of their employees fit that description. They've done this for many years when there's bushfires, for example, earthquakes, even on the onset of COVID in the US, they started a program to try to get 100,000 rooms for frontline workers, for example, the emergency workers or the healthcare workers that might be traveling from different cities. So, I mean, I think there are some good things about that, but then you still have the same underlying issue that people are turning housing, the hosts are offering housing with converted housing for these, and no one's actually living in the spaces that are being provided. And also, there's really no cost to Airbnb to provide the housing. The hosts are offering this, and in many cases, the hosts are getting paid for them. In a small, I think in the early examples of the COVID response, the hosts were offering rooms, but only about 10% of them were free for the workers, and so the hosts were benefiting. I think Airbnb either reduced or took out their commission, so they're not benefiting from it, but they benefit from the brand and pretending to do good. But also the hosts do accept fees in many cases. So I think it's just another example of Airbnb's PR machine, and they have lots of cash in order to do things like that. And so, yeah, definitely, I think there are other examples like that we see.
Okay, thank you very much, Murray and Kenneth. Thanks to all our panelists. Since there are no further questions in the chat and we are also running out of time, I would like to conclude this webinar by thanking all of you for this very interesting webinar, for your very interesting presentations, for the discussion about the study that has been published today, written by Murray and Kenneth. As I already said, it's been already a media success, but now we have to make the content a political success. And therefore, I'm very grateful also that you shared your concerns, but also your political, let's say, positions, and also your wishes for lawmakers like Leila and Katalin and me. We have to be very vigilant when the proposal from the European Commission will be published next week, the legislative proposal for the Digital Services Act. We will, but still I think that this webinar clearly showed that it might be worthwhile a shot to work towards a stronger and better regulation also at the European scale. And it might also be worth a shot to fight for data transparency, that Airbnb finally is forced by law, by regulation, to reveal, if possible, the data that are necessary for the local authorities in order to regulate them better in their respective cities or in their respective member states. And I also think that this webinar clearly showed, and I'm very, very grateful for that, that it is necessary for us sharing progressive ideas to work on a broad network, a broad international network that reaches out also to the US and to other continents, but that also combines the different member states, different cities, because the struggle against the business model of Airbnb and other platforms, which then leads to financialization, touristification, gentrification, precarization, Uberization, etc., is a common struggle that we have to lead, and we can only succeed in working together and building that strong network. So thank you again for being with us today, for your very interesting presentations. Thanks to all the participants for listening in, for raising the important questions. And I don't want to end with making a promise, but at least you can be assured that we try our very best. Thank you very much. Bye.